All right, I'm here live at the National Conference for Media Reform. I'm here with Lisa Graves. Lisa is the executive director for the Center for Media and Democracy, which you can find, of course, at prwatch.org. Lisa, thanks so much for talking with me today.
Oh, Matt, thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
All right, so Lisa, you guys are here. You're here on a panel, but you're also here screening a documentary called The United States of ALEC. Tell us all about it.
Well, that documentary was produced by Bill Moyers, one of the greats in journalism in this country. He decided that having seen our expose that we launched in July of 2011, that it was really an important story for all Americans to hear, because it's a story about how corporations are exerting extraordinary influence over our laws, and they're doing it in secret, way beyond what people think is happening. In fact, a lot of people think corporations already have too much power. If they only knew what was happening in ALEC, they'd be absolutely certain of it.
Right. You're talking, of course, about people aren't aware. It's the Media and Democracy did this amazing, just intense, just study called ALEC Exposed. So tell again. Talk a little bit about just how purely evil ALEC is here.
Well, so it's the American Legislative Exchange Council, and so when the whistleblower contacted me with the bills, I knew we had to do everything we could to make sure to build a resource for people to connect the dots, for ordinary citizens and the press to be able to say, this is an ALEC bill, this is an ALEC legislator, this is an ALEC corporation, and this is what the bottom line is. Because they've been around for 40 years, and they have influenced almost every area of law in our states. Some of their bills do things like make it harder for Americans to vote. Some bills make it easier to get away with murder. Some of their bills basically say that you can't have local democracy to keep a nuclear plant out of your backyard. They have bills against having any new taxes on windfall profits of oil companies. They want to say that if you or your loved one, your parent, your child, your spouse dies or is injured from an FDA-approved drug, over-the-counter or prescription, you can't sue. These guys have a terrible agenda. It's an agenda to basically make the corporations that are part of ALEC richer, and the right-wing ideologues that fund ALEC, like the Koch brothers, force their will into law. And it's, I think, a deeply pernicious organization. And on top of it all, they claim that they do zero lobbying. They've told the IRS for 40 years they don't spend a dime on lobbying. We have email after email after email showing them asking for bills to be introduced, asking for them to be passed. And we know that what ALEC does, its core operation, is to have corporations vote as equals behind closed doors with state elected officials on bills, and then have those bills get introduced and passed in your state house without having any disclosure that those corporations wrote those bills or actually voted on them with politicians out of your sight.
Yeah. So that's illegal, right? If you're a lobbyist, you have to register as a lobbyist, and is that illegal? I mean, it seems like that there are lobbying rules, right?
Well, you're having the right reaction.
Yeah.
There are lobbying rules. They vary in some ways by state. Some states have better laws than others. The IRS has its own definition of lobbying. I think that really, no matter how you slice it, you can look at our emails, and it's quite clear this is lobbying. If it quacks like a duck, walks like a duck, it's a duck.
Right.
And quite frankly, what ALEC's doing in that regard is particularly, I think, deceptive in my view, because they know exactly what they're doing. They're bringing corporations together to vote as equals with politicians. In fact, their internal literature that the whistleblower gave me says that one of the unique features of ALEC is that corporations get an equal, quote, voice and vote. And so they know exactly what they're doing. And
right.
And they know that they're sending dozens and hundreds of emails to legislatures every year asking for bills to be introduced and passed. That's lobbying.
Yeah.
And yet what they do is provide a vehicle for corporations to basically launder their lobbying money and get a tax write-off. So every dollar spent by the Koch brothers in their personal capacity, or Koch Industries, one of the biggest privately held corporations on the planet, it's a tax write-off for them. It's a tax write-off for Big Tobacco. It's a tax write-off for AT&T. It's a tax write-off for some of the big pharmaceutical companies to give to ALEC, because it says it's not a lobbying organization.
Wow.
And so it's operates like a charity, like the Red Cross.
So we're essentially paying for them to destroy our country, essentially, through our tax dollars.
Well, we're subsidizing it. What that does is it means that there's less money available in the tax revenue for things that ought to be supported to help make our country better, to help rebuild our infrastructure, to help rebuild the American dream. Because if you're getting a tax write-off for something that you know is lobbying, when you're sending your lobbyists, when we did the count on ALEC Exposed, when we launched the project, we found a couple of really interesting things. ALEC says it's a nonpartisan or bipartisan organization, and that it's an organization of legislators. Here's what our study found. 103 out of 104 of their leaders in ALEC, the legislative leaders, are Republicans.
I'm shocked.
One Democrat. Maybe now they're to 98%. Who knows? But basically, their leadership was almost entirely right-wing Republican, often Tea Party Republican. We also took a look at their finances in great detail. They talk about how, again, they're a legislative organization. We found that over 98% of their revenue comes from sources other than legislative dues. 98% of their money comes from corporations and sources other than the $50 a year that lawmakers pay. Meanwhile, corporations are paying tens of thousands of dollars to get an equal vote at the table. That's what they're paying for. It's totally a pay-to-play operation. And so that's why we've helped expose it. And we've had some great colleagues in the field in this country who have also worked very hard to help expose ALEC, including Color of Change, which really spearheaded a dramatic campaign on getting corporations out of ALEC. So the labor unions have done a tremendous job through their pensions of trying to really have these pension plans make a choice about whether they're going to support companies that are part of ALEC, that are pushing this agenda to make it harder for Americans to vote, that are trying to kill worker rights and undermine the long-time rights of unions in this country and workers. And we've had a tremendous amount of work by Progress Now that has worked to ask legislators to get out of ALEC. 71 legislators have gotten out of ALEC, 44 corporations, 6 nonprofits. The 44 corporations are actually sort of shocking. One was Walmart.
Wow.
When Walmart doesn't want to be your buddy, you've got a problem. Bank of America got out a few months ago.
Right.
And we also had 6 nonprofits, including the Gates Foundation, said they weren't going to fund them anymore, but they have a grant with them to work on privatization of education issues. And 71 lawmakers have gotten out, in part due to the work of Progress Now. And Common Cause filed the IRS complaint, and People the American Way has continued to do a tremendous amount of work to expose the right-wing infrastructure. So across the board, we've had just some real stellar work by a lot of public interest groups, and my organization, which is based in Madison, Wisconsin, has been very busy telling the ALEC story. We helped analyze nearly 1,000 bills. Now we're way over 1,000.
Wow.
We documented over 1,000 politicians that are part of ALEC so people can connect the dots. We documented nearly 700 corporations that were part of ALEC. We've written over 250 stories about ALEC. We've helped produce, write, or edit well over a dozen different special reports on ALEC. And we just launched a new project about the right-wing infrastructure echo chamber about ALEC called the State Policy Network, SPN. And it's $80 million it's spending to help advance the ALEC agenda. We've been busy with that, but we've also been busy fighting Fix the Dead and exposing their conflicts of interest. So we've got a lot of work going on at ALEC Exposed, a lot of work going on at PR Watch, and we'd love for people to come and be our Facebook fans, like us, and follow us on Twitter.
Before I let you go, I guess my last question is, why do you think it is that, the right obviously gets that so much of the fight that we're doing is on the state level, and I think due to work of like people like you and your organization, I think the left is sort of starting to wake up to that. A lot of it is just like seeing these ridiculous bills get passed, seeing the voter rights taken away, all the anti-choice bills that are happening everywhere. But it still feels to me that the left still doesn't grasp just how dire local politics actually is. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think there's a growing group of individuals and organizations that are working at the state level. There have obviously been a lot of groups that have been on the front lines of those states for a long time, but they're sort of a beltway-itis in some ways, where everything is about Congress for some of the groups. And I understand that in part, having been in Washington for about 15 years and worked in all 3 branches of the federal government and as a senior advisor, and also worked for the ACLU as their top strategist on national security policy and civil liberties. But the reality is that Congress is basically, in my opinion, sort of a lost cause. It's broken.
Yeah.
Congress is broken. The House, with the way redistricting is done, you can have a House of Representatives that is basically not elected by the majority of Americans.
Right.
The number of Democratic votes just dwarfs the number of Republican votes, but they won at a crucial time in redistricting to be able to control the House of Representatives and control what they do.
Which again goes to show that they understand the fight. They understood that, if we take these governorships, if we take these state houses, we will win on the larger level. That seems that they understood that. How did the left miss that?
Well, there's no doubt that the Republicans had a long-term game plan to coming into 2010, and they knew they were going to be in trouble coming out of the 2008 elections. Obviously, they've been trying to distance themselves from Bush. To this day, they don't want to talk about the Bush administration for the most part. They don't even have them at their conventions.
Right.
But the fact is that besides all that, they really worked hard to put in place a lot of maneuvers and mechanisms to try to win in 2010. They came out of that 2010 election cycle with emboldened with big numbers. There were ALEC majorities, ALEC majority legislatures in numerous legislators across the country, and also ALEC alums as governors. And so they were able to move their agenda basically just in lockstep and roll over the opposition and basically treat our legislatures as if it was a corporate takeover, and they didn't have to negotiate with the opposing party. They didn't have to behave the way politicians usually do, or the way they used to do, which was to recognize that sometimes they're up and sometimes they're down, and you can't always have such recrimination toward your opponents, because the next time you may be on the bottom.
Yeah.
These politicians acted like they were going to have a permanent majority, and they were working to change the structure of our country in terms of the elections to try to ensure that permanent majority. That's through voter suppression efforts, like making it harder for Americans to vote, and numerous efforts to make it more difficult to vote, early vote, to register in different ways or different locations, and to have even groups be able to register people to vote.
Right.
So they've had a long-term game plan. On the left, I would have to say, there's been a lot of interest in a lot of obsession in some respects in Washington, what's happening in Washington, what are the bills in Washington, but a lot of interest in what's happening at the state level. Certainly the labor unions have been fighting those battles on the front line for years and not getting a lot of attention for their battles that have been going on. But I think that it's in some ways part of a larger problem that I would describe as it has a twofold problem in my mind. One is that there's a sort of a lack of imagination and vision of where this country should be in 40 years. Instead, a lot of the folks who are progressives are trying to defend an ever-shrinking way it used to be, as opposed to really articulating what could be even better.
Right.
And so they're stuck in a defensive posture. And it's natural to be in a defensive posture when you're being attacked and your rights are being assaulted and undermined and eroded on every single, in every single way. However, if you play defense, you'll always play defense. You have to put the other side on defense in order for you to play offense. And one of the things that I was most disappointed with in Washington was that there was an affirmative policy until recently that basically Democrats were not going to embrace constitutional amendments. They were taking it off the table. They had taken some advice from a group called the Constitution Project that you should only amend the Constitution in extraordinary circumstances. Basically, it was perfect. This was a firewall for them to try to fend off Right to Life Amendment, Victims' Rights Amendment, and other amendments that the Republicans were pushing in the House and Senate. However, their unilateral disarmament on the amendment strategy did not take away the firepower of the right. In fact, the right just expanded and continued to expand the use of amendments. Now, they didn't win those amendments. They didn't get constitutional amendments on those issues, but they won legislative battle after legislative battle by making that a symbolic ideological victory that to be for the Right to Life Amendment, to be for the Victims' Rights Amendment. And then what that allowed them to do was to be for an idea. And that being for an idea versus a statute that's compromised and weak and has problems, to be for an idea allows them to have strategic patience.
Yeah.
Because then they can use every loss as fuel for why we need to have more to win that battle in the long term. They basically position their allies and their activists to be in for a long-term fight. What you see on the left is a bit of just exhaustion and atrophy, because they're fighting so many fights, and every fight is just heartbreaking and devastating to lose. And then people feel like they can't win, they can't change, and they're not. And I think that too often some of the groups do not encourage people to realize this is a long-term fight, and we're going to lose these battles, some of these battles. But the loss is fuel to really build the case for the changes that need to be made to restore the American dream and to restore our American democracy.
Lisa Graves, again, she is the executive director of Center for Media and Democracy, prwatch.org. Again, the work with ALEC Exposed is phenomenal, and really some of the most important reporting that's happened in the last couple of years. So congratulations on that. Thanks for taking the time, and thanks for being on the show.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you so much.